Over the last 13 years, 25 movies and 3 TV shows, the MCU has given us some great villains and some pretty forgettable ones. So today I'm going to stop and rank all 47 MCU villains from the worst to the best. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies and TV way too much. With that in mind, if you're up for the challenge, join me down below in the comments section. Share your ranking of all 47 MCU villains, or if you want to do something a little bit easier, who are some of your favorites and who are some of the worst? And to state the obvious, this video contains spoilers for the entire MCU, including Shang-Chi. Also, I'm not ranking them based off how powerful they are, but based off how compelling of a threat they pose for our heroes and how interesting they are as characters in and of themselves. My list isn't the right list, it's just my list. I would love to see yours in the comments, and let's get started. In last place, Malekith from Thor the Dark World. Easily the most boring and forgettable villain in the entire MCU. If you put Malekith in a lineup with 5 other Dark Elves, I couldn't pick him out. If you asked me to explain 5 unique qualities about Malekith, I couldn't do it. I just know he's a Dark Elf that wants the ether, and he's evil and old. Only 4. And that just makes him not remotely interesting or compelling because there's nothing to latch onto. There's nothing to care about. He's just a fill-in-the-blank villain that I don't know anything about, therefore he's in last place. Coming in at number 46, the Mandarin, Trevor from Iron Man 3. For obvious reasons, I considered not including him in this list, but for 2/3 of the runtime of Iron Man 3, he is treated as this menace that Tony is trying to stop, and then he's revealed only to be this doofus and used for as lowbrow of humor as we have ever gotten in the entire MCU.
I wouldn't go in there for 20 minutes. Now,
there's a couple things about the character that are mildly interesting in light of the Hail to the King short, as well as his inclusion in Shang-Chi, but for the most part, a very bad way to subvert audience expectations. Next up, the Supreme Intelligence from Captain Marvel. Given their name, you'd think they'd be supreme in intelligence, and that's not really the case here. You'd think they'd have a better plan for controlling Captain Marvel that wouldn't fall apart so easily, that could allow for her memory to be restored. You'd think they'd have a basic knowledge of her actual power set. Not so much. So despite their name, they never really feel like they're ahead of the curve with our heroes. They don't pose much of a threat. They're visualized in a very awkward fashion.
not impressed.
They just seem to exist to be this hierarchy power structure that she's gonna battle and take down, but they're not interesting at all. Number 44, the Shockers from Spider-Man Homecoming. Here they take a classic Spider-Man villain and turn him into not one, but 2 different ineffectual henchmen. There's no backstory, no greater motivation, just 2 guys with some mild shocking powers that get taken out pretty easily. 43, the Sovereign from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Their antagonism with the Guardians is the inciting incident for the film, and then they show back up in the 3rd act, but in a lot of ways, they're actually kind of victims in this story because Rocket steals from them. So right off the bat, it's not the most compelling villain scheme that they're just looking for justice, but then beyond that, they're played basically as parody of themselves. They're written to be highly advanced and pretentious and full of themselves, so much so that they're entirely incompetent. And despite the fact that the Guardians are kind of goofing off and not taking anything seriously, they're still able to defeat the Sovereign quite easily. And so they just never pose any sort of interesting threat or exist for much more than comic relief. Next up, Sutur from Thor Ragnarok. Now this is the character that's actually responsible for the actual Ragnarok event. At the end of the film, he's the one dueling it out for eternity with Hela. There's not much character here. There's not much motivation. He's just a force of nature that's relevant to the plot And that's about it. He suits the plot point. Coming in at number 41 is Sonny Burch from Ant-Man and the Wasp, a generic arms dealer that's not particularly menacing, but he is played by a fun actor. The movie is intentionally lighthearted, so as a villain, he only really poses a threat because he complicates their rescue plan because he's trying to get the lab himself. In and of himself, not that interesting of a villain. He does fit the plot of the movie, though. Bringing us into the top 40, Taskmaster from Black Widow. Easily one of the most disappointing villains in the entire MCU and an enormous waste of a bunch of potential. The trailers teased this great villain with an interesting power set that could create a lot of trouble for a more grounded hero like Black Widow. And instead, we got a glorified henchman with a backstory. A character with absolutely no personal motivation. She's just a biological robot following someone else's commands. And there's an interesting comic book character called the Taskmaster with a similar power set, and they ignored all of that for this. And it's a character designed to make Black Widow more interesting and flesh out her backstory and information we learned about her back in the Avengers.
Can you wipe out that much red? Dreykov's daughter?
But as a character in and of herself, there's just nothing interesting here because she makes no choices for herself. Beyond that, the movie wastes Taskmaster's power set. The idea of a character that can instantly learn other people's fighting styles and use them against them has so many obvious, interesting ways that can play into a story. And here, it's just used for a couple of site references to the Avengers here and there, but it's not used in any significant way. The character disappears for the entire middle of the film, so just an utterly disappointing use of a cool character. Number 39, Sharon Carter. Once a hero teaming up with Captain America after Thanos' snap, she decided to break bad, work for herself as a bad guy. There's potentially something very interesting there, but the execution in Falcon and the Winter Soldier doesn't deliver on the potential there at all. And a big part of it is that the show attempts to treat the fact that she's a villain as a mystery and a big twist reveal at the end of the season, and it doesn't work at all because it's so unbelievably obvious that she is the person that they've been looking for this entire time. So when it's revealed, it's like, right, yeah, of course it's her. And instead of spending time developing what exactly happened to turn her evil, fleshing that out so it doesn't just feel like it came out of nowhere, we spend times with all these red herrings and misdirects that don't work whatsoever. So I didn't buy into the transition. I certainly didn't think it worked as a twist reveal and mystery. So this one fell totally flat for me. Then we have Kaecilius from Doctor Strange, potentially an interesting character and motivation that ends up just falling flat. The idea of a sorcerer who notices some of the hypocrisy of the Ancient One and breaks off from it should be a much more compelling villain than when we actually get in this movie, because he's so underdeveloped, gets so little screen time, that all the interesting complexities of someone that notices the hypocrisy that could potentially cause the audience to question who's right and wrong, the movie doesn't really end up doing that. It picks such a distinct side and presents him as the villain while just teasing the more interesting idea. So as much as Mads gets a little bit of his personality to shine through, the character as a whole doesn't really work. 37, Taserface from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. The villain of the middle act of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 happens to have the coolest name of any villain on this list.
Taserface.
He's as ruthless as he is stupid, and that's kind of the problem here. They have to write him to be unbelievably cruel to make up for the fact that he's so wildly incompetent. Because he's stupid, he can't possibly pose any reasonable threat for our heroes, so they just have him doing really, really bad, awful things. Now, he's a little bit memorable because there's plenty of jokes to be had with a character this stupid. And because he's so cruel, it does provide some redemptive arc for Yondu by contrast. So that's why he's not in the absolute bottom of this list. But once again, another pretty forgettable, ineffectual villain. Next up, Yellow Jacket from Ant-Man. About as stock of an MCU villain as you can get. The character's fine in isolation. Corey Stoll's performance, perfectly acceptable. And he does do some ruthless things like going after Lang's daughter to exploit one of our hero's specific and unique vulnerabilities. But it's weird just how similar this villain is to Obadiah Stane from Iron Man. In his motivation, his connection to technology, a suit, all of that stuff. It's like beat for beat, same thing as Obadiah Stane. There's even some interesting, unique things that they had in the script about the particles messing with his brain a little bit, but they don't explore any of those to give him anything unique. So just, as I said, a stock, generic MCU villain that does the job and nothing more. Number 35, Karli Morgenthau, a bad version of Killmonger. And what I mean by that is that it's a character who's driven by some noble cause, trying to correct some injustice the character sees, and they turn to villainous means to do it. Unfortunately, the show is so desperately trying to make her sympathetic that they don't make her threatening or villainous at all. For the first 3 episodes, she's just stealing medical supplies, and then eventually she does blow up a building, kills 3 innocent people and doesn't care at all, and then is responsible for Lamar's death. But then the show tries to draw our attention to John Walker, who got revenge for Lamar's death, instead of the fact that she's killing people now. And the final episode ends with Falcon giving a lecture on how we shouldn't consider her a terrorist. And if the show is trying so hard to convince me that she's not so bad and not a villain, eventually I believe you. And that's not a good thing. That'll bring us to RazorFist from Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Basically a henchman with a little bit of extra screen time.
But a guy with a freaking machete for an arm just chopped our butts in half.
He's essentially the face and personality of the Ten Rings. Whatever he does, all the other soldiers do. So he represents this army that our hero is basically battling against. And in doing so, there's something a little bit interesting about that. There's no character arc. There's not a lot of depth here. Just a few memorable moments and fight sequences. Doesn't really individually pose a threat to our lead character in and of himself, but he poses a threat to the other characters and our hero's desires and what they're working towards. So there's a little bit of intrigue there, especially as they change sides in the middle of the final battle, but nothing great or all that interesting. 33, Whiplash, another totally wasted character. His backstory has ties to the Starks going back decades. He has the intelligence and resourcefulness to create these incredible robot suits just like Stark. Right there you have a character with the potential to be an actual serious threat to Stark. And then they put him in a movie where he's just in labs the entire runtime. For the first 30 minutes, Stark doesn't even know that he exists, that he has this one little fight scene with the whip arms, and then Stark believes he's dead for the next hour of the movie, and then he just reappears in the final act for a big showdown. So anything interesting they could have done with Stark trying to find this guy, outthink him. No, Stark doesn't even know that he exists or is alive throughout the runtime. So just a total waste of a great idea for a villain for Stark. Next up, Aldrich Killian from Iron Man 3. A decent version of a villain trope that we've seen many times before and we've seen since. Probably the best thing going for this character is that he is this mastermind that came up with this puppet version of the Mandarin to distract our hero from the actual threat that he poses so he can get close to our hero, infiltrate a bunch of different things while Tony is dealing with all of this fake stuff going on. But his actual motivation, it's just Syndrome from The Incredibles.
And when everyone's super, no one will be.
This guy that feels burned by our hero, that comes back years later, looking cooler and with powers, wanting revenge. It's just not very compelling or interesting to me. And the Mandarin that they set up that was fake seemed a lot more compelling than who he turned out to be, in which case they created a scenario where they make their villain seem even more forgettable than he already was. 31, Ghost from Ant-Man and the Wasp. Not specifically a villain, but certainly an antagonist towards our heroes in the film. She doesn't have malicious motives, but her desperation to survive and stop being in pain is driving her to do evil acts. There's something inherently interesting inside of that. The big problem here is that essentially it's a character that if she would just sit down and have a conversation with our heroes, we could resolve this. They could work out a plan where everybody gets what they want. And the only reason that doesn't happen is because if it did, the plot of the movie wouldn't take place. And so that cheapens a character that otherwise I think could be a bit more compelling. We've made it to the top 30 with Dormomu from Doctor Strange. Now this is a bit of a frustrating one because Dormomu is our introduction to these dark realms that pose this incredible existential threat to our reality, so much so that the only reason that Doctor Strange was able to defeat Dormammu was using his wits and cleverness to force Dormammu's hand.
Dormammu, I've come to bargain.
But, as cool as all that sounds, Dormammu doesn't get a lot of screen time or development. He's just there for a clever final little bit, kind of lingering in the background all throughout the movie, and we get that one scene with him. But besides that, it just feels like wasted potential of a great big villain. Along those exact same lines, Dweller in Darkness from Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Once again, this is an evil force in the background, alluding to horrible things in other realms, but treated more as a reveal and a boss fight than a lingering threat throughout the entire film. Once again, this is a character that's also used to manipulate the more interesting villain in the film to do his actions, but not so much as a character in and of itself. Certainly, there's some cool throwdowns in the final moments of the final battle in this film. We do get the spectacle that we want, but also it's only alluding to the full potential that could be here in the future. 28, Dreykov from Black Widow. Now, what I appreciated about this character is that what he's doing is so creepy, disturbing, and human that he's a character that you absolutely want to see defeated. And one of the most important things you need to do with a villain is create someone that it's satisfying when they're torn down. And this guy is kidnapping little girls, slaughtering a bunch of them if they don't live up to his standards, and he's using them just so he can gain power. They allude to how much control he has in the world and all of his many schemes throughout the decades. The problem here is that it never goes to that next question of why. He's just evil. He just wants power. That's all we kind of know. So there's several things about him that I do find interesting. He fit the more grounded nature of Black Widow as a film in that he's doing something that feels more personal, which fits that story, but not a great villain beyond that. That'll bring us to Ego from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. As much as I thoroughly enjoy Kurt Russell and love that he's in the MCU, I don't think that Ego worked all that well as a villain, and the big reason for that is that for the vast majority of his screen time, he's playing catch, taking naps, or delivering exposition. They don't design him to build dread or pose any sort of threat until it's revealed, wait a minute, he's a super bad guy and a celestial. And even though our heroes didn't know that he was a villain, have fallen into this situation, somehow they're able to defeat a celestial all in the one battle sequence. And while it does cost Star-Lord a great bit to defeat him, at the same time, it doesn't feel fully earned because we just found ourselves in this situation 10 minutes earlier before we were trying to defeat him. So for me, I just don't think it worked the way the story was developed, the way the character was established, for me to even care enough about what was taking place, because it just felt so messy. But I'm not a very big fan of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, if you haven't figured it out yet. 26, Ronin the Accuser from Guardians of the Galaxy, as well as Captain Marvel. Now, I know it's an unpopular opinion, but I actually do prefer Ronin the Accuser to Ego from the second film.
What are you doing?
I'm distracting you, you big turd blossom.
He's generic, he's cliche, but he has a clear motivation. He's a true believer in his cause, that his people have been wronged, and therefore he, as this zealot, is attempting to exact revenge. He's also a character that betrays Thanos. He's willing to go against Thanos of all characters. And so, while he doesn't have the most distinguishing characteristics, at least he didn't frustrate me the way that Ego did, and I knew what he was trying to accomplish all throughout it. I think the biggest wasted thing here is that they put him in Captain Marvel and didn't actually do anything with him to develop the character any further and help us understand him or add any more intrigue. 25, the Chitauri and the other from the Avengers. Now, this is a type of villain that you can only do one time, and that's the cannon fodder army. And that's what they are. They exist for the sole purpose to provide a whole bunch of different aliens, types of creatures and stuff for our Avengers to absolutely obliterate, and that's what it does well. They pose a meaningful threat because there's a lot of them. They're getting guidance from Loki, and they challenge our heroes on every front, but they are just cannon fodder, and it's fun to see them get destroyed. 24, Crossbones from a whole bunch of different movies. In a lot of ways, he is just a henchman, but he's also the face of the Hydra agents that have infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. He's the face of the betrayal of Captain America, that you have these ruthless soldiers working for this shadow organization that we as the audience and Captain America don't know is out there, and then when it's time to turns on Cap immediately. He works with a bunch of other people, they're powerful, and so there's just something interesting, compelling about it. I like Frank Grillo as an actor, so I think that's why he's a bit more interesting to me, while there's also not a ton of substance here. Number 23, Yon-Rogg from Captain Marvel. Not the most memorable supervillain on this list, but I think he did fit the movie that he was in. He actually has a friendship with Captain Marvel. He likes her. He respects her. He's still a bad guy that's using her. He's not the most menacing of villains, but he's exploiting the fact that she doesn't know who she is and how to use her powers in order to manipulate her into serving him. And there's something very conniving about that that's interesting. Unfortunately, they didn't know what to do with him in the back half of the film, as soon as she learns who she is, he's entirely vulnerable to how excessively powerful she is, so he stops being interesting once she knows who she is. But I think, at least at the beginning, there were some interesting dynamics in how he was used and how the plot played out. Next up, Hayward from WandaVision. Now, I know this is a guy that a lot of people hated, but I actually thought he was a pretty interesting character until the very last episode. The reason for that is that he's the hero of his own story. He survived Thanos' snap and had to live in that post-apocalyptic world where the heroes had failed, and he's trying to find a weapon to help save humanity. That's not a bad thing. He doesn't perceive a vision as a person, but as a weapon. And from his perspective, that's not unreasonable. Wanda has taken a city hostage and he wants to stop her. That's not unreasonable. And so for most of the story, he actually challenges our understanding of who's right and who's wrong in this story. It's not clear cut that Wanda's the hero and he's the villain. He has a lot of good points. Fortunately, as you move into the last episode, he just gets very cartoonish and over the top in his actions, and they try and turn him into a mustache-twirling villain after having set up very reasonable motivations and kind of cheapened their own character. 21, Abomination from the Incredible Hulk. I actually dig Abomination enough. He fit in the movie that he was in. It's a fairly simplistic story. He's the evil version of our hero. It's a soldier who just lives for the next mission, that wants any advantage that he can get, and in doing so turns himself into a monster, and he doesn't have the morality of a Banner to be able to control that. Thus, we get our big monster showdown in the last 10 minutes. I felt it worked well enough, it was interesting enough, and provided a nice boss fight at the end of the movie. Not a top tier villain by any means, and I did appreciate the fact that he's reappearing now in Shang-Chi, and that they didn't forget the fact that he existed, and it raised a bunch of questions like, how did Wong get him? Like, what's that all about? Kicking off our top 20, Mysterio, and this is a really frustrating one for me, because with a better script, Mysterio easily could have cracked the top 10. Jake Gyllenhaal is great in the role. He can play the charming, charismatic, fake superhero, but he also can play the hammy villain when he's supposed to. They also found a way to take technology previously established in the MCU and combined it with Mysterio's power set in the comics in a really interesting way. But once again, we have a villain motivated by scorn for Tony Stark.
Hit me, baby, one more time.
Even after Tony Stark died, they went with the most overused villain motivation in the entire MCU. Beyond that, what exactly is Mysterio's goal here? To become a fake superhero? What's he gonna do when a real threat shows up? It just seems like a villain concept trying so hard to be clever that they forgot to make sense, which is frustrating because if they had a fresher motivation and a better script, he easily could have been a great villain. 19, Zola from the Captain America movies. One of the architects of Hydra that works behind the scenes. He's not gonna win in a physical confrontation. He's not the upfront villain, but behind the scenes, he's responsible for so much of what took place inside of the MCU. So while not having a ton of screen time, not being the flashiest character, an interesting addition. Next up, Ulysses Klaue from Age of Ultron and Black Panther. He's this side villain that fills out the history and the world of the MCU. He's this arms dealer that's stolen vibranium and Wakandan technology, and he sells it to whoever will give him money. He's been around working a long time, and he's kind of a character that's played with a bunch of charisma, but he doesn't necessarily have a big scheme, but his actions have great relevance for what takes place in this world. Then we have He Who Remains from Loki, this Wizard of Oz-esque mastermind behind the scenes that's been controlling the sacred timeline. He's responsible for there not being a multiverse because he defeated the multiverse in some point in time in the past, in the future. It's a little bit difficult to say because of the nature of time in the show Loki. He's played to be conniving and mischievous and almost anarchist in a certain way because he gives them a choice where they get to choose whether this thing stays together or devolves into multiverse chaos. And there's just something fun about a character that is so thoughtful and controlling, but okay with chaos at the exact same time. So while he didn't get a ton of screen time, he was that mystery at the end of the show that we were waiting to discover who it was and what his actions meant, and it teased so many bigger things, and even as we're seeing, had big ramifications for where Phase 4 is headed. Number 16, Justin Hammer from Iron Man 2. I actually really like this character, and I hope we get more of him inside of the MCU. He's not a top-tier villain, but he's not really supposed to be. He's someone that is jealous of Tony Stark, that has the resources of Stark, but lacks his intelligence, and it leads him down these dark paths where he still doesn't fully realize he's the villain inside of the story, And there's something interesting and compelling about characters that don't know that they're a villain as they keep heading down this path. And his resources and jealousy make him reckless in the process. So I hope at some point in time he can come back, whether it is in a mildly redemptive sense or as once again being a villain in the mix. Number 15, the Red Skull from Captain America: The First Avenger, a classic Captain America villain played by a fantastic actor that I wish I could have higher on this list, but I don't think he was written all that well inside of this actual movie. Now, he does have ties to the Infinity Stones and establishing very early on the Infinity Saga and the threat that these items pose. He's part of establishing Hydra, this major villain all throughout the course of the history of the MCU, but in the film, the character's basically used to deliver exposition. Every time they cut to him, he's just delivering speeches about what he's doing. And so he just comes off as the mustache-twirling villain out to get stones for power. And that's not as interesting as he could be if they developed him a little bit more and his relationship with Captain America. I just think there was more they could have done there, while still being played by this great actor that has an amazing presence on screen. Next up, the Children of Thanos. Now, they're not characters given a tremendous amount of backstory and personal motivation, but they are true believers in Thanos' cause, and they are utterly ruthless and without remorse. Likewise, they're designed to be so powerful that they pose an actual threat for our individual Avengers, so much so that they have to team up together to try and defeat them, and they're not always effective at it. And that's what you want from your villains, people that pose an actual threat, and that's what they do. If you stop and think about it, they're essentially henchmen that pose a greater threat and are more powerful than most of the actual main villains on this list. Number 13, Agatha Harkness from WandaVision. Now, what makes her interesting is despite the song claiming it was Agatha all along,
and I killed Sparky too.
She's actually only taking advantage of what Wanda did in and of herself. There's something conniving about this character that uses her greater knowledge to exploit a person in pain who's causing pain to a bunch of other people, and she's doing it, all of it, just to gain more power. She's manipulative, but most importantly, she's fun. You like to see her on screen. She's a nice addition while not even having all that grand of a master plan here. That'll bring us to Obadiah Stane, Ironmonger from Iron Man. Actually, in my notes, I wrote Jebediah Stane down because I guess I got my old-timey Civil War names all mixed up. Anyway, I think this is one of the most underappreciated villains in the entire MCU. It's a proper use of the evil businessman. His original scheme in the film makes enough sense in that he's a war profiteer that views Tony Stark as this entitled rich kid that doesn't deserve the company that he owns, and he wants to get him out of the way. From there, he uses Tony Stark's narcissism against him. At the beginning of the film, Tony is this reckless playboy just living for celebrity, and then later in the film, he's obsessed with his new mission as a superhero, and because of that, Stane is able to work behind his back, manipulate things, and make things happen. But I think in general, a really nice villain that fit the film that I actually wish they'd extended his story arc over the first two films. Number 11, Alexander Pierce from Captain America: The Winter Soldier. If Captain America: The Winter Soldier takes a lot of influences from political thrillers, that means Alexander Pierce is kind of this political villain inside of the MCU. If you put him in a fistfight with Captain America, he will lose, and he will lose very badly. But what makes him a threat is that he has so much tremendous influence over these government-controlled organizations. He has bureaucratic power. He's been working behind the scenes to take control, and because of that, our hero didn't even know that he was a threat, didn't know what he stood for, and that's what makes him interesting, compelling. What Alexander Pierce did caused us to reinterpret everything we thought about S.H.I.E.L.D. as an organization and realized that it was actually being controlled by something else. We finally made it to the top 10 with Hela from Thor Ragnarok. Another child of Odin, but minus the moral compass. We sort of get to see what an evil Thor could look like. Very early on in the film, they established that she is a physical threat to our hero because she's able to easily crush and destroy Mjolnir, taking away the weapon that Thor is so known for carrying. From there, she's able to wipe out the armies of Asgard, perhaps almost overplayed the way that happens because it has to minimize the Warriors 3 for it to happen in not the best written scene in the film. But all of it establishes she's a true threat with connections to Asgard that flesh out the history of Odin and his failures in the past. It's kind of been alluded to that he hasn't always been the best guy or made the best choices, and she is an example, maybe the ultimate example of that coming back to haunt him, his family, and his kingdom, and it has dire consequences. Number 9, the Winter Soldier from Captain America the Winter Soldier. Mysterious villain with ties to our hero's past that poses a physical threat to him. While he is a weapon of these other people, what makes him interesting is that that weapon is built out of our hero's best friend, and our hero values loyalty above almost anything else. So the idea that his best friend that protected him is right in front of him, it creates the ultimate contrast inside of him that he has to stop this weapon, but he can't kill this weapon. He has to find a way to redeem the villain of the story, in which case it's the perfect balance for our character. Next up, Ultron from Age of Ultron, an insecure child with Tony Stark's personality that utterly misunderstands his mission on this earth. Part of what makes Ultron so interesting is it's always fun anytime our heroes are responsible for creating the villain. And in this case, Tony Stark's biggest enemy has always been himself and his recklessness. And so he goes rogue and does something extraordinarily dangerous with technology and items that he doesn't fully understand. And in doing so, ends up creating this horrible, horrible villain that in certain ways mirrors him and creates also this incredible threat for the entire planet Earth that the Avengers must assemble to stop. Now, Ultron, I don't think lived entirely up to his potential, as there are a few too many times that I think they undercut him as a threat for the sake of comedic relief. And Stark's sarcasm coming out of a robot that's a villain, I don't think works quite as well as it does with Tony Stark, the hero, and it undercuts a few moments. So I think there were so many pieces here that were so close to that top 5 level of villain. They're just undercut by a couple of moments where they just pivoted in the wrong direction. Number 7, Baron Zemo from Captain America Civil War and Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Now, I think this is a character who has aged really well with time because he sees our heroes differently than we see them. He was tremendously hurt by what happened in Age of Ultron, and it caused him to turn on superheroes and people with power. Whereas we see heroes as being the protagonists of these stories, he sees them as the antagonists that are causing pain to people in ways that we don't even see and realize. And in doing so, he enacts a plan that tears the Avengers apart, that eventually causes Thanos to be able to conquer Earth and get all of the Infinity Stones. But I think especially through some of the dialogue in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, you start to understand his worldview and see superheroes and people with powers in an entirely different light and the danger that they pose. We have Wanda, Scarlet Witch, a character who frequently works with the good guys, but also frequently works for the bad guys or accidentally becomes the villain inside of her own story. She's tremendously powerful, but also deeply broken, doesn't have full control of her powers, and doesn't realize what she can do. At the beginning of Age of Ultron, she's working for Hydra. At the beginning of Civil War, she accidentally causes the death of a whole bunch of people while trying to save others. And then, of course, in WandaVision, she's so deeply heartbroken
I can't feel you.
that she accidentally takes an entire city captive, torturing them in the process, and doesn't free them even when she's repeatedly told what she's doing. And that's what makes her such a captivating character, is that she can do horrific things and justify it in her own mind because she's just trying to cope with the pain that she's dealing with. She's the hero of her own story. Even for a town full of people, she's the villain that's taken them all captive and is torturing them. In fifth place is the Vulture from Spider-Man Homecoming. A nice, refreshing change of pace for MCU villains because he's not a sociopath trying to blow up the Earth. He's not even trying to blow up the city that he lives in. He's just a guy that felt burnt by the system, that decided it was okay for him to break the law to try and make a living for his family, and in the process turned into a villain. He poses this threat for our hero in that he knows our hero's identity. He can expose him. And therefore, while not needing to have the biggest villain scheme, he's interesting, he's compelling, he feels like a real person because he's a dad, he's a husband, but that doesn't change the fact that he's also doing evil things. That's just a nice, refreshing take on an MCU villain. In fourth place, Killmonger from Black Panther, one of the most well-rounded villains in the entire MCU. He poses a physical threat to T'Challa and is able to defeat him in combat as this trained assassin. But beyond that, he also has a master plan to manipulate the rules of Wakanda and his own personal lineage to take control of the entire country. While he is a villain that needs to be defeated, by the end of the film, he's won the moral victory, caused T'Challa to change, and thus swayed Wakanda in a different direction. And that's what great villains do. They pose a credible threat to our hero while having stakes high enough that make the story interesting and that cause our hero to change throughout the journey of stopping the villain. Real quick before I give you my top 3, remember to join me down below in the comments section. If you're up for the challenge, share your ranking of all 47 MCU villains. If you want to throw more in or take some out, by all means do it, or just share some of your favorites and least favorite villains. Also, if you enjoyed this video, I've done a ton of MCU rankings, the heroes, the movies, the final battles, all of that fun stuff. You can check it out right up here when this video is over. In third place, the real Mandarin Wen Wu, a deeply complicated and conflicted character. Throughout his 1,000-year lifetime, he's done a bunch of horrific things in pursuit of power, but more recently, he's tried to be a family man. He found love. He tried to put all of that pursuit of power and evil behind him. But in doing so, it cost him the love of his very long life, which once again drives him into his most cruel, tendencies. But still, in his relationship with his kids, he loves them. He wants the best for them. He wants them to join him on this quest to get their mother back. But it is that loss of the one person he ever loved that made him incredibly vulnerable despite possessing the 10 rings. Therefore, he was able to be manipulated into going onto this quest to unleash these horrible creatures upon our world. And it's that complexity, his cruelty towards his kids, while his deep love for them. He's an evil man, but that doesn't mean he doesn't and didn't love his wife. He's incredibly powerful, wise, and at the same time, easy to manipulate because of that pain that he feels. And it's that conflict, that contrast that makes him so interesting. Speaking of conflicted characters, our runner-up, Loki, from, well, the entire MCU, one of the most complex and morally interesting characters on this entire list, in that he's constantly betraying the people that he loves the most. He does care about them deeply, but in his pursuit of validation, in his pursuit of meaning, he's willing to turn on those he actually cares about. He's betrayed all of them, but he's also defended them. He hates it when others wrong them, but he's willing to wrong them himself. And as much as he can be the hero and can do good things and has good inside of them, he can also kill hundreds and thousands of people on Earth just to try and assert his dominance in pursuit of importance. He's so wildly insecure while putting on this exterior of confidence. Whenever you think you've figured out Loki and all of his many complexities, you haven't. There's always more layers, more stuff driving his psychology, and that's just what makes him such a fascinating character. But coming in first place, Thanos from the Infinity Saga. He's a mastermind playing the long game to achieve his goals. He has seen the atrocities that come because of the limited resources in the universe, and he comes with this audacious and cruel plan to try and stop suffering in the universe by, in another sense, causing a bunch of suffering.
Because that's what heroes do.
He's a true believer in his plan, and while so much of what he does is absolutely cruel, they also show us that he truly cares about people. And as much as he's on this mission to try and wipe out half the galaxy,
I am inevitable.
He's not just doing it at the cost of others. He is personally willing to sacrifice that which he cares about the most in his journey to accomplish this. And we see the pain that it causes him to fulfill his destiny and his mission. Beyond that, he poses a legitimate threat for our heroes, both because he has a master plan, he has tremendous resources behind him, he's a large, physically imposing dude, but then when he really starts to enact his plan, he has Infinity Stones, which require all of our Avengers to try and stop him, and they fail in doing so initially. Put that all together, he has emotional resonance, he has a backstory that makes sense, and he poses an actual threat in the process, so he comes in at number 1. If you enjoyed this video and want more like it, check out that playlist right over there with a bunch of my other MCU rankings. Also, I did this video right down there where I did a top Marvel movie bracket showdown. It was a ton of fun. I'd love it if you check that one out. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.